Hello again, and welcome to another Pokemon video. What you're seeing is footage from Crystal Version's Battle Tower, a facility that, due to its ties to the mobile system, is technically entirely lost content in Japan, since they never enabled it in the Virtual Console release. Internationally, they made it accessible freely by heading west out of Olivine City. The way it works is simple. You take 3 Pokemon you have, choose a level to fight at, and then complete 7 battles. Win them all and you get 5 vitamins you can use or sell. I think I've got a pretty good system for farming them, but it's not that interesting to look at on its own, so instead I'm going to talk about my playthroughs of these games as a whole. For those of you who got linked this video and haven't seen my playthrough yet, a couple months ago, around when Scarlet and Violet came out, I began a weird type of playthrough of Generation 1. I was primarily inspired by a playthrough of Metal Gear Solid 5 that went through the game 3 times, each time adopting a different playstyle, and I aimed to do that for the first generation of Pokemon, as there's more than one way to play these games. I also did this because I wanted to see for myself if the old game still held up after 20 years. If you're interested in my findings and final thoughts, keep listening. The ideas for the 3 playthroughs were as follows. In Red version, I would aim to complete the Pokédex and use as many different kinds of Pokemon in the major battles as I could. In Blue version, I would use only 2 Pokemon for most of the game and optimize them as much as possible to be the most powerful. In Yellow version, keeping with the game's own anime theme, I stuck to only using Pokemon used by Ash in the show. And also I sort of tacked on a severely glitched playthrough of Green version as well. You can't have Gen 1 without the glitches, can you? The Blue version playthrough was easily the most boring, so let's start there. As I said, only 2 Pokemon are used heavily throughout this playthrough. Dugtrio, the fastest ground type in the game, and Squirtle, the best of the 3 starters, no contest. Anyone thinking Bulbasaur is the best starter is only thinking of gym types and nothing more. Available moves are way more important, and through TMs, Squirtle has access to enough overpowered attacks that he can run over almost everything in the game with little resistance. You're able to do this in most Pokemon games, and it's probably how each of us played at least one generation in our lives. Battles are one-on-one, so do you need more than one Pokemon? Well, in my case, I had Dugtrio pinch hitting for Squirtle. You can catch him at a very high level, unlike most of the other Pokemon you find, and he has some excellent moves available as well. That final battle was a bit of a sweat, however, the only real sweat in the game. Suffice to say, Gen 1 is nowhere near the greatest game design of all time, and the Red version playthrough compounded that idea for me. Not only did I want to use a variety of Pokemon, I also wanted to complete the Pokédex. 2 things that require a lot of leveling up for every newcomer, and grinding in Gen 1 is just awful with no convenient form of EXP share, and a very common annoyance is that most Pokemon found in the wild lack any form of damaging move that isn't normal type, and that means that no enemies can easily be defeated without spending a TM. Suffice to say, rather than grind out the last few evolutions for the Pokédex, I simply duplicated rare candies. This may sound strange to hear, but prior to this playthrough I actually lacked an understanding of how single-player Pokemon works, and that's saying something coming from the guy who has created ROM hacks of Fire Red multiple times. Ultimately, what I learned from these playthroughs is that in order for a Pokemon freshly caught to be viable, it needs 2 things. 1, it needs moves matching its type, learned early and without a TM. 2, it needs enemies to fight that can be easily defeated for a lot of EXP. One of the non-starter Pokemon that I did use quite a lot in Red version is Oddish, which starts with Absorb, can learn status moves, and is caught before the Cerulean Gym, giving it plenty of water types to fight as well as rock types the hikers use, and it wound up becoming a staple of the Red team. This should be the gold standard, and only a few other Pokemon are this good to simply pick up and use. I did miss a few opportunities to use others though. The most surprising playthrough, or should I say shocking playthrough, was actually Yellow version. I originally thought Yellow version was merely some special edition meant to hold us over until Generation 2, and it pretty much was, but what I discovered is that Yellow version actually improves upon the original versions. Most notable is that the major opponents like gym leaders have better movesets and teams. You'd be surprised at how few opponents in the original versions had actual attacks, which made most of them very much boring. This was rectified in Yellow version. You're going to notice more threatening moves appear more often in the latter half of the game. This version also gave a number of Pokemon better moves learned through leveling up, though it was mostly out of necessity because with Pikachu as a starter, the player needs to find something else to defeat Brock at the start of the game, which is also a refreshing change to the usual formula and has the effect of communicating to the player the importance of raising a diverse team. Of course, players who caught and used Nidoran quickly found out that they could solo the game with it for the same reason players could solo the game with a starter in the original versions. In my case, I was using only Pokemon Ash used in the show, so I had to get Mankey instead. This was a very interesting change because it resulted in lacking the kind of bulk the starters normally have. Put simply, teamwork became far more important. I couldn't simply rely on Pikachu all the time. Ironically enough, I relied on Haunter instead. So, did Gen 1 hold up after all these years? Well, it would be crazy to claim that they're the gold standard of game design or have something none of the other generations have, but they definitely hold up as individual games. The notorious glitches don't disrupt the gameplay as much as you think, and if you ask me, as Gen 1's gameplay became less interesting compared to its successors, the glitches gave rise to a new wave of players simply for the potential for experimenting with tricks. Above all, Gen 1 is also just plain important to me. They are the foundation of an entire franchise more valuable than Disney Corporation, and influence the role-playing genre greatly. I have to respect that. Shame the series' own rights holders don't seem to. After completing Gen 1, I was unsure if I wanted to jump into a similar playthrough of Gen 2 straight away. I could keep the basic premise and not have to do as much collecting and leveling since I could transfer my Gen 1 collection, or so I thought at the time, but this time I would want to put more research into the kinds of strategies I could create. As I looked over what items and Pokemon were available and where, I found myself getting excited about the prospect. But what encouraged me to do it for real, and sooner rather than later, was discovering that the online sentiment was that Gen 2 sucked horribly, worst in the series. This was baffling. Granted, everyone has their opinions, but it seemed rather strange to peg Gen 2 as the worst, when it had lots of great quality of life, a huge amount of optional caves, and an entire second region, and most importantly, Lugia. I mean, if you prefer the remakes, I totally get that, they're even better, and as much as Gen 2 did for this series in the long term, Gen 3 did even more on top of that. But if we're going to call Gen 2 the worst, that means it has to suck even more than Gen 1, everything from Gen 6 onwards, as well as any of the Sinnoh games barring Platinum. And that seemed highly unlikely right out of the gate, unless nostalgia is just that strong for me. Which it is, yeah, but is it unfounded? Well, I can tell you one thing right out of the gate. Gen 1 has at least one thing that makes me never want to play it again, that being the Lieutenant Surge trash cans. They're unfun and terrible, and thankfully they got rid of it in Gen 2, and Gen 2 doesn't really have any equivalent moments that make me not want to play it. So, that's one thing Gen 2 has over the originals already. Of course, the trash cans were brought back in both of the remakes of Generations 1 and 2, but that's neither here nor there. And also, strength boulders weren't a lot of fun in Gen 1 either, they were really slow to move around. Gen 2 also has quality of life improvements, like a move deleter, less menuing to select HM moves, and the EXP meter and EXP share item made grinding at least feel less time consuming, though it still took ages to grind out evolutions. More on that later. So, right out of the gate, we can already see that Gen 2 is improving on Gen 1, so that's a good start. As for the playthroughs, this time around the 3 playthroughs of Gold, Silver, and Crystal didn't have any specific goal in mind. That is to say, rather than do a solo run, a variety run, and a crazy run like I intended before, they all wound up doing a mix of the 3, albeit with different strategies and Pokemon being used throughout. Many of them are just plain more usable. There are a lot of Pokemon, old and new, with better movesets and enemies for them to take out. I actually backtracked in a few spots to find what I initially missed out on and grinded them up to show them off. I wasn't going to miss any opportunities this time. But not all Pokemon had good learn sets, in fact many of the new Pokemon are very much lacking there. Now, it's worth noting a common criticism of the game here, and it's that the availability of the newcomer Pokemon is very odd. A small handful are restricted to the postgame, and many of those are of the new Dark type. Many newcomers are also 1 in 100 encounters unless a swarm is occurring, and these can only occur if the player exchanges phone numbers with the single trainer to inform them of a swarm, and gets lucky enough to receive a call from them. Then you have a number of Pokemon carefully tucked away in rarely explored corners of the region, and the fact that gym leaders generally aren't using the new Pokemon all that often. That is to say, the Johto region does a poor job representing itself. Game Freak's thinking may have been that the new Pokemon were supposed to be like secret creatures, and the player discovers these themselves rather than facing them in battle. It's well known that Generation 2 was intended to be the grand finale to Pokemon. They didn't know this was going to turn into a long-running series. So they were probably thinking, oh, we need to make the new Pokemon something that the player has to search and discover themselves. It's like a bonus on top of the original cast rather than an actual expansion to the cast. Sort of. And don't get me wrong, I agree with criticism of this as well as a bunch of other weird decisions the developers made, such as availability of evolution stones, the addition of trait evolutions through held items, and the annoying addition of the friendship mechanic. Raising friendship is very much a pain for various reasons, and then you have like a half dozen Pokemon obtained through the breeding mechanic, which in Gen 2 has a lot of annoying properties, and then there's Hitmontop, roaming legendaries, time-based events, encounters, evolutions. If you're listening to all this and thinking, man, Gen 2 sure sucked, I don't blame you. These are some of the most common criticisms of Gen 2, and they aren't wrong either. All of this really does suck for someone trying to complete the Pokédex, which I did, so I can attest to that, but I think the critics are missing something. Does all of this stop you from playing the game and having fun? Because it didn't stop me. I was having a blast in my playthroughs. Pokemon is a winning formula that always finds appeal somehow. Just ask Switch players. And I'm not saying you can't have fun with the modern generations. What I am saying is that in theory you can find something enjoyable in any generation. Looking back at my playthroughs, I was still able to build and customize all 3 of my teams, with far more options available than in the Gen 1 playthroughs thanks to TM availability, and that's not all. Gen 2's greatest strength lies in the sheer number of optional areas and events. To have this many optional caves and tunnels this early into the series, each with items and Pokemon defined, is quite ambitious, and those caves open up more and more as you collect more HMs. Even story dungeons have additional side paths that you have to come back for later, like it's some kind of Metroidvania. Lots of items and TMs are hidden throughout the region, though I do admit many of the rare consumables could have been evolution stones. Those are far too uncommon, and there are even locations where you find all kinds of different stuff based on where you enter the area from. Exploration is a huge part of Johto. Now, the in-game clock can potentially be divisive. On the one hand, the many daily and weekly events, once-a-day activities and such, give the player something of a daily login bonus, and NPCs could also appear based on a schedule. The whole thing makes Johto feel more alive. On the other hand, though, most players probably don't like the idea of having to turn the game on X day of the week at Y hour, and getting up in the morning for those particular encounters is annoying as heck. But you can also think of it as making the experience a little different based on when the player chooses to play. Each player is getting a different experience based on when they play and where they explore thoroughly, and that isn't too bad a concept. Near as I can remember, this is one of the few Pokemon games to actually operate this way. Then there's the gym leaders. Now, nobody ever said gym leaders were challenging in general, but Johto's leaders, for the most part, succeeded in presenting me with a proverbial wall to get over. You can get over that wall in many ways, and it's really easy if you know what you're doing, but that's how they were designed. How do you deal with Whitney's Miltank, or Morty's Gengar, Jasmine's Steelix, or Claire's Kingdra? It's on the player to come up with a plan. This puts Gen 2 way the heck above Gen 1, where you never really need to experiment or have a plan beyond using your strongest attacks over and over. I will admit that Chuck and Price really need to be stronger than they are, and Kanto's leaders were all designed to reflect their in-universe strength compared to yours, i.e. Janine is weaker due to being the newest gym leader, Blue is the strongest due to being a former champion, and so on. Giving players a better challenge probably ought to have come first, but to be honest, I don't know if monotype teams can do that in post-game. In fact, let's discuss Kanto itself. Many are quick to point out that having an entire second region to explore doesn't mean much if there isn't a lot to do beyond 8 more badges and next to no additional plot, and the aforementioned gym leader difficulty doesn't help. They're not wrong, but I'll be quick to point out also that being able to revisit an old region in the same game, refight the original cast, and discover that the region has changed since 3 years ago are all features way ahead of their time. The remakes would rectify the lack of content, mostly because they had more cartridge space to work with, but I think the biggest issue with the original Gen 2 postgame is that it gets hyped up for being an entire extra region when it's really best to think of it as a victory lap, which is not too dissimilar from most Pokemon postgame content, come to think of it. And the battle with Red is still the most epic battle in the series. If you're thinking it takes a lot of grinding to match him, well, anyone could beat him at level 50 with a solid strategy like I did. Gen 2 is also noteworthy for having one of the most memorable rivals in the whole series, which isn't saying a lot. The series never really gave us great characters outside Generation 5. Gen 2's rival is not liked simply because he was a huge jerk, which is a huge misconception I think people have about the dislike of friendly rivals. He was liked because he had a backstory as the son of Giovanni, really wants to be the one to defeat Team Rocket, the player and the champion, and had an actual character arc, which we can confirm in his final rematch, where he has a Pokemon obtainable only by friendship, which you wouldn't think he would have any earlier. Random NPCs even talk about him throughout the game, and he isn't just sitting in the champion room waiting for you, he can be found in other locations as well. Of course, in order to know any of this, you would have to actually explore the game, returning to previous areas, reading NPC dialogue, discovering where he is, so you can actually have that final rematch. These are things that just really aren't that common in the series these days, or at least I don't think they are. And you know something else? Saying all of that really makes me think that Generation 2 was something of a product of its time. I mean, back then, players looked at video games far differently than they do now, especially in Japan. And so I think that very different mindset influenced the design of Gen 2. It's a lot more exploration-based, there's a lot more reading between the lines, there's a lot more paying attention to little details, stuff like that. Anyway, I think I'm getting a little passionate about running defense for Gen 2. I'm not even sure if it's as outright hated as I think it is, but to this day I'm still seeing people going way harder on Gen 2 than I think it deserves. After multiple playthroughs, I can easily say that Gen 2 is in fact not the worst in the series, maybe even far from it. I don't want to come off as an elitist for understanding the game better than everyone else. That's one of my biggest pet peeves in internet discourse. Nor do I want to list off a bunch of conspiracy theories as to why I think Gen 2 gets this treatment. What I do want to say is that I think Gen 2 is considered the worst in the series precisely because people view it through a particular lens, constantly comparing it to other generations but only with regards to aspects unrelated to the most important parts. And so, to conclude this entire mess before it turns into a 7-hour video essay, no disrespect to people who have made those, these playthroughs have been entirely worth it and have made me appreciate the older generations a lot more than I used to. The question now is whether or not I continue playing the series and go on to the Hoenn games. I already know they're worth the time, but I question whether or not I would want to complete another Pokédex with even more weird evolutions and not having the ability to transfer from previous games. I will have to take some time to work that out, and I have a lot of other games to play and content I want to make, so it may be a while before the time is right for it. In the meantime, as always, I'm Ephraim225, and I hope you'll stick around for whatever comes out from me next. See ya!